minutes past the bottom of the hour here. Let's go ahead and get it started. So, hello and welcome to our CFO Huddle. I'm Eric Harper, and I'm the Director of Business Development at PAAS Advisors. Today, our host will be President and CFO at PAAS Advisors. That's Gary Ritacco, and also Managing Partner of Sourcing Advisors Group, Serge Milman. We want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. If you have questions throughout the event, feel free to submit them in the chat box. It's in the right-hand corner of the screen, or you can email me, eric.harper@paasadvisors.com. That's PAAS advisors.com. I'll now pass it over to Gary to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Our objectives for this web conference call are the following today. With very few exceptions, companies can reduce vendor spending, a number one or number two cost area, by at least 15 to 20%. This applies equally to emerging firms as it does to Fortune 100 firms and every firm in between. These results are attainable across COGS and OPEX spend categories through a focused, rigorous, and aggressive approach. And despite the opportunity, most firms, based on public data and our experience, have been unable to make an EBITDA contribution through their strategic sourcing practices. Today, you will come away with, from this talk, insights into common pitfalls to generating value from strategic sourcing, confidence that you too can reduce costs and increase EBITDA by 20% or more, and a cheat sheet of provocative questions to ask of your procurement teams to validate the opportunity and define a path to realize the value. I'm Gary Ritacco, President and Chief Financial Officer at PAAS Advisors. For over 35 years, I have owned, invested in, and led technology companies. And during that time, we have developed solid contacts with many of our leading technology and software companies. At PAAS Advisors, a technology procurement consulting company, we leverage that experience to help our clients realize high-value cost savings with their technology supplier spend in technology and licensing and supplier contracts through spending categorization and contract negotiation. Joining me is Serge Milman, Managing Partner at Sourcing Advisors Group. Serge?
Hey, thanks, Gary. First of all, thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate it. Like Gary, I bring about 20 years of business process reengineering and strategic sourcing expertise. Strategic Sourcing Advisors is an advisory firm working specifically in procurement optimization and strategic sourcing services. So with that, I'd love to kick off and introduce the notion and our view that strategic sourcing can generate substantial cost reduction and EBITDA improvement across industry sectors. Our experience is that firms can generate cost reduction somewhere between 15 to 20% across the board. The EBITDA impact varies substantially. For services firms, it's anywhere between 10 to 30%. For manufacturing firms, given their much lower margins, the EBITDA impact is often 50 to 200%. So in addition to the financial benefits, there's a whole host of second-order benefits that can be generated through strategic sourcing. And these include operational benefits, risk management, and innovation. And so these factors are incidental to the financial benefits, but they're nonetheless very meaningful and important contributions. So what we find that more engaged procurement and business unit teams are generated as a result of the elimination of the busy work that we'll talk about a little bit later. What we find is that with the consolidation of suppliers and the increasing importance of the supplier relationship, both from the buyer perspective as well as from the vendor perspective, the risk management capability becomes possible. And finally, with a smaller number of important or preferred suppliers, it now becomes possible to engage in product and service road mapping and planning to identify opportunities for innovation with your suppliers. And so in general, we believe that in booming times, strategic sourcing, given its financial and other benefits, generates highly desirable results. In difficult times, and I think that the times we're in today, with substantial layoffs across industries, with more chatter about the oncoming recession, we think strategic sourcing provides the needed flexibility for and support for both short-term and long-term goals. So with this in mind, now that we've sort of said, look, there is a pot of gold out there, 15 to 20% cost reduction, EBITDA increases of 10 to 30 or more percent. Let's talk about some of the challenges and some of the gaps, or as the optimists would say, opportunities that exist for firms. So first of all, I want to define what strategic sourcing means. And for us, strategic sourcing is the art and science of restructuring and renegotiating vendor spend. And I would say that strategic sourcing is far more art than science. It's important to understand that vendor spend is either a number one or number two expense on most companies' P&Ls. So somewhere between the number 1 and 2 and 3 expense for most companies happens to be vendor spending in total, salaries, and then non-cash items. And so we believe that strategic sourcing has a substantial impact and is a major lever for companies to pull. What we also know when we look across industry and we look at different companies and their performance is that most companies have been unable to generate positive EBITDA from strategic sourcing. And actually, the real story is a little bit worse than that. What we're actually seeing is that there's a negative EBITDA contribution. And that's because from public data, as well as from private experiences with our own clients, what we're seeing is that vendor spend is actually increasing either as fast or faster than revenue growth. And so there's a variety of reasons why this is happening. And we think there really are 5 key themes underlying these trends. And we'd like to go through each of those very quickly to explain both the challenges and the opportunities. So the first one is around leadership. And so first, I think it's important for us to recognize that contrary to popular belief, procurement does not actually own vendor spend or supplier spend. That is actually owned by business units who purchase products and services from their budgets. Again, I would add, if this is a point of contention, I would ask you to go to your chief information officer, to your chief marketing officer, to your business unit officers, and ask them if they believe anybody but them actually owns any part of their P&L. In most cases, I think the answer that you'll get is that they are the owners and they're being held accountable for it. And so if we start with this notion that procurement doesn't actually own vendor spend, what is its role? And we believe that the role of procurement really is that of an in-house consultant. It's the procurement's role to actually identify opportunities across the enterprise to take out costs and identify efficiencies. The problem that we're seeing, and I'm sure it's well familiar to most people on this call, is there's a level of distrust or friction between procurement and business lines. And so we're all familiar with anecdotal evidence of business units pulling in procurement at the 11th hour simply because they had to. And vice versa, we've also know the anecdotal stories where procurement shows up to business and says, hey, I've got this grand solution for you. And business says, you know what? I don't want it. I didn't ask for it. No thanks. And so this friction and this level of distrust, I think, is indicative of a lack of leadership across what is a large enterprise-wide initiative. From our perspective, there is no better sponsor for these sort of initiatives than a chief financial officer. And I think there's a reason for it. I mean, first of all, we already said this is an enterprise-wide initiative. There's a need for somebody who can look across the company and manage those opportunities. Second, there is a need for centralization of that effort, which clearly belongs somewhere above the business unit levels. Third, when done correctly, the EBITDA impact from strategic sourcing is substantial and frankly, often market moving. Hence, there is a need to balance and manage those benefits. So our experience shows that CFO really are the best place sponsors for these kind of initiatives, both during formation as well as during the actual event. The second gap that I think exists and prevents companies from maximizing the value from strategic sourcing is one around skills. I think, said plainly, most strategic sourcing initiatives lack subject matter expertise, right? And so in some ways, we'll have executives, both chief procurement officers and CFOs and other executives say, you know what, that's just not true, right? I have a former technologist leading my IT category, or I have a former plant manager managing my cost of goods sourcing, or, you know, I have a former HR professional leading my benefits categories, and so on and so forth. And that's all good. I think a big chunk of what's missing are the sourcing specific skills. That is, you know, we've already said that we think that strategic sourcing really is an in-house consultative function. And as such, part of that function is around having the skills to extract and frankly often develop business requirements for each product group. Part of that is having the analytical skills needed to assess purchasing patterns and to disaggregate unit prices to enable for fact-based price negotiations. Part of that is the financial analysis that's needed to manage a large volume of data. You know, part of that is the cognitive ability to distill complex, voluminous data into a simple bid document that suppliers can ingest and respond in a way that is helpful to the team. And finally, we think it's a matter of seniority and perhaps more importantly, personality and willingness to negotiate aggressively, right? Not everybody has that. It's nobody's fault. It's just a personality trait. You know, what we find is there's plenty of that on the supplier side, and there's a clear lack of that in-house in most procurement teams. And so these gaps, we think, are clearly evidenced by a number of factors that some of you probably have seen in your organizations. And some of those things include poor master data, right? So time and time again, we hear from clients and surveys across industry that procurement has really poor data. It's dirty. It's not usable. Nobody really trusts it, right? And so for us, you know, this is an issue around a lack of leadership in driving performance, right? With hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars invested in spend management solutions and a dedicated group of analysts in many organizations, you know, data should be cleansed. You know, because the data in many organizations isn't usable or is in poor shape, there's often little or no data-driven insights, right? And from our perspective, data is only good if we're drawing out insights from it. If we're creating those aha moments that we can leverage into value as we go into negotiations with suppliers. You know, the third area are category plans, right? And so everybody has a category plan, but what we're seeing is a lot of category plans are often templated, they're generic, and they often have little or no insight into what's actually going on in a given category. You know, we often see the absence of detailed business requirements. And again, as the name implies, these requirements must be vetted and approved by businesses for each product and service. So it's a laborious effort. It's time-consuming. It takes a lot. It takes a lot of skill, but it's an absolute must. It's a prerequisite before going out to bid on a product or service. You know, there's frankly a lot of oftentimes there's a lack of contractual KPIs and SLAs that matter to business, right? We think this is a big gap, as well as RFX documents. So these are the RFIs and RFPs that are put out that are often just simple templates with minimal detail about any given category, right? And so all of these things and others are evidence of a skill gap that exists in many organizations, right? And you know, contrary to popular belief, strategic sourcing is a difficult undertaking. It's extremely challenging. There is real effort and expertise required to generate 20% EBITDA improvement, right? And what we're finding is most procurement teams are under-resourced and often overpowered when they square up to negotiate with suppliers. The third area that we see that is a big gap is around the tools, right? So nirvana of the tools will solve the problem, right? And what we're seeing is a lot of teams are opting to solve the skill gap problem in particular with deploying tools. And tools are fantastic, but there's some common truth about tools. One is the implementation risk of tools is very, very high. You know, most project managers will tell you that the failure rate for implementation hovers somewhere in the 70 to 80% rate, right? That most implementations take, you know, twice as long and they cost 3 times more than budgeted. So there's a huge deployment risk, right? There is a big push by a lot of procurement organizations to implement, you know, machine learning, artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, RPA solutions, and the like. I think the challenge is we believe that these tools are immature for production environments, and frankly, there are not very many PhDs in most procurement organizations to run these highly advanced tools, right? So, you know, again, tools can be very helpful, but they will not help organizations, and procurement specifically, leapfrog to best in class. My favorite example of this is around CRM, right? If you go to any head of sales, you know, chief revenue officer, and you ask him or her if they've ever seen an instance where a CRM implementation had magically transformed a mediocre sales team into sales superstars. And with 99.99% certainty, I will tell you that you'll never hear a yes to that answer. And likewise, I don't think that will ever happen in procurement. Tools are helpful, but best practices and skill set are prerequisites for success, in my opinion. And then there's the last set of options, and that's around outsourcing services like e-sourcing and tail spend management and the rest. And these solutions can be helpful until you find out that actually that these solutions leave somewhere between 50 to 80 cents on the dollar on the table. So these solutions actually only scratch the surface of the total cost reduction opportunity. So the fourth key gap that we're seeing is around the incentive alignment. And so we believe very strongly that just like sales teams have a high level of incentive to produce, procurement needs a similar level of incentive. Certainly this applies to when you've decided that you're going to go and seek out third-party support. You know, our experience is that every third party is an expert until you ask them for a performance guarantee. And then all of a sudden you see the field clear. So our view is specifically for strategic sourcing initiatives, skin in the game, using some sort of a gain share model is an absolute requirement to make sure that you mitigate your risks and increase your odds of success. The last lever, the last gap that we see that inhibits value creation through strategic sourcing is one of around performance management. And specifically, what we're seeing is that teams are inundated with what we call busy work, right? So hundreds of spend events, right? Going through a vendor by vendor sourcing approach, you know, expanding their supplier base, oftentimes simply because they can. And so we think that these activities actually inhibit performance management, which for us is a very critical component of value creation in terms of partnering with business units, tracking performance, and engaging business leaders and P&L owners to identify the gaps, to specifically identify areas where perhaps they're buying from somebody other than the preferred supplier, perhaps they're buying off contract, and identifying opportunities to address that so that A, you can meet your business needs, and B, you can maximize value creation. So with that, I turn it over to Gary.
Thanks, Serge. A lot of good stuff there. You know, so as it turns out, strategic sourcing is a challenging enterprise-wide initiative. But this undertaking, when done correctly, is uniquely positioned to generate 20% or more EBITDA improvement, and usually within a year. We've highlighted some of the challenges on the slide here, but they can all be overcome. Another way to view a challenge is to recognize the opportunity. And we believe that, particularly during these difficult times, strategic sourcing offers firms an undeniable opportunity to reduce costs and increase EBITDA. It's yours for the taking. Knowing the value creation is possible, all leaders should be leveraging the procurement teams to drive bottom line results. So here's 3 simple questions you may want to ask your team to evaluate the potential opportunity. Number 1, what is our total enterprise spend with suppliers? The total spend should include managed and unmanaged spend across all lines of businesses, inclusive of third-party managed costs such as IT, P-cards, travel, and others. You and/or your procurement team should be able to answer this within 30 seconds by referring to their dashboards. Number 2, how many sourcing events have we done this year? How many are planned? And what is the average value of each? If the answer is more than 10 sourcing events and less than 5% of total vendor spend per category, then you can be certain of a gap to best-in-class practices. Serge, can you chime in on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, part of the strategic sourcing, right? Strategic sourcing 101 says that a lot of the value can be generated through supplier consolidation, category consolidation. And so we believe that the best approaches to strategic sourcing is sourcing a category wherever possible, not necessarily an individual supplier, right? So to that end, the sourcing, for example, in IT, right, should include a single sourcing event in IT should include a big chunk of software and hardware, given that the vendor breadth, the capabilities of our suppliers can cover both of those large categories. right? It's not 100%, but 70–80% of the category can be captured within a single RFP.
Great, thanks, Serge. And number 3, what is the EBITDA contribution that was generated by sourcing? You will likely get an answer based on contract value, but what you really care about is the impact on the P&L. Ask for traceability analysis. If it does not exist, in most cases, the cost reductions likely will never materialize. If cost reduction is less than 15% and EBITDA contribution less than 15%, then there are gaps in best practices. There's some takeaways. So, in conclusion, we'd like to thank you for spending the last time with us. We know your time is very valuable. And in gratitude, we offer a no-cost, no-obligation opportunity assessment. We will provide you a customized inside-out preliminary assessment of the effectiveness of the current sourcing program relative to EBITDA contribution and the untapped opportunity. For public firms, we rely on a published 10K and 10Q for data. For private firms, we'll need limited financial data under an NDA, of course. And if you're interested, you can contact either Serge and I. Our contact information is on the slide, or email sourcing@sourcingadvisorsgroup.com, as you see, on the slide. Eric, do we have any questions from the group?
Yes, we do. The first one here for you guys is, our IT spend is increasing at a very high rate. What initiatives can I take to control it?
Well, I'll take that one, Serge. I think the answer is in a lot of what Serge said, which is, IT typically, we've seen with our clients, IT costs reside in anything from, various line items on a P&L. We've seen them in office supplies. They reside in contract modules, sometimes with truck leases and equipment leasing. But first and foremost, it's to identify the key spending categories and then take contracts and actually put them into a contract dashboard that identifies them under technology and, with, various information associated with it. But first and foremost, it's to identify and categorize IT and break it out from the typical indirect cost sections on, general accounting information. Next question.
Yep. Another one we have here states, there isn't very much time on my calendar to lead this sort of initiative. How do CFOs allocate their limited resources?
Do you want to take that?
Sure. Look, in most cases, the ask from the CFOs is that of a sponsor. So the actual time requirement is short. It's a few hours a week, potentially, right? What is important is the commitment from the C-suite to these kind of initiatives to provide support to the working team.
Great.
Thanks, Serge. So it seems like we've kind of, we're coming to the top of the hour here, and now we'll be respectful of everybody's time. So we'll send the response to the other questions by email, and then we'll also be in touch. Feel free to reach out, like Gary said, to either Gary or Serge, or sourcing@sourcingadvisorsgroup.com.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks for your time. Take care.